Hello, my sweet friends. This is Mrs. Gomez, and today we will be reading Seekers, The Quest Begins, Chapter 9, Toklo. Pebbles of frozen ice caught in Toklo's claws as he dug through the snow, searching for something to eat. The sun glowed red in the sky as it crept slowly down below the trees, and an ice-cold wind raced up the mountain, slicing through his fur and making him shiver. Oka had not moved for the rest of the day, nor had she spoken. She lay beside Toby, unmoving, as the day passed and night crept on again. Toklo could see they would be staying here again tonight, even though his belly was howling in protest. The salmon couldn't be too far away now. Surely they were less than a day's travel from food that would finally fill him up. What if his mother never moved again? Did Oka want him to stay here until his spirit grew so hungry it joined Toby's in the water? He wished she would see that having one living bear cub was better than having two dead ones. It was also better than having one alive and one half dead. Now they could travel faster and take care of each other better. His claws snagged on something soft, and he brushed away the snow to uncover a pile of moss. It was damp and soggy and crumbled in his paws, but he swallowed it down anyway. He scooped up some of it and brought it back to his mother, where she lay under their rough shelter. "I brought you some moss," he whispered, laying it close to her muzzle. Oka didn't open her eyes. The small shape of Toklo's brother lay curled between her paws, limp and still. Toklo lay down behind his mother and crept slowly nearer, dragging himself along on his belly until his fur was touching her curved back. She didn't move, so he rested his muzzle on his paws and closed his eyes, falling into an uneasy sleep. The sudden movement of Oka's body behind him startled Toklo awake. He scrambled to his paws, noticing that the sun was starting to rise and the sky was streaked with gray clouds. Oka stood for a moment, her head bent to sniff Toby once more. "It's time to go," she said. Relief spread through Toklo. He didn't have to die along with his brother after all. "To the river?" he asked. "But first there is an earth ritual to attend to," Oka said, as if she hadn't heard him. She turned and saw the moss that Toklo had brought the night before. "Yes," she murmured, "that is what we need." Gently, she took the moss in her jaws and laid it down on Toby's fur. Then she swung her head up and stepped out of the den, her paw steps measured and heavy. Toklo padded after her, confused but afraid to speak in case she snapped at him. Oka nosed through the snow, digging loose bits of earth and twigs. She clawed a pile of dead leaves together, carried them back to the den, and laid those on top of Toby as well. Toklo didn't know what she was doing, but he hoped that if he helped her, they could leave sooner. Copying her, he gathered dirt and branches and dragged them back to the den, where he helped her cover his brother's body until it could not be seen anymore. Oka lifted her head and spoke, her deep growl echoing off the back of the den wall. "Spirits of the earth, I commit this innocent cub, whom we called Toby, to your care. Take him back into the warmth of your fur and protect him. Guide his paws through the rocks and the soil to the water that lives deep within you, and let him join his fellow bear spirits in the river that flows eternally." She paused, and Toklo wondered if he was supposed to say something. Oka scratched her claws through the dirt one way and then the other, leaving a crisscross of marks next to her cub's body. Still without speaking, she turned and walked away, out of the den, onto the open slope of the mountain. Toklo hesitated for a moment. It didn't seem right to be leaving Toby behind. Toklo pressed his nose into the mound of dirt and leaves and branches. "Toby," he whispered, "we're going to the river now. I know you need to get there too, so follow me, all right? I'll take you to the river." Toklo stepped back and shook his head, brushing off the leaves that were stuck to his fur. Then he hurried after his mother, who was setting a brisk pace down the mountain. She didn't speak to him, and he stayed silent, frightened by the tension in her shoulders and the faraway look in her eyes. It was nearly sun-high when Toklo noticed something at the edge of his hearing. It was a fast, rushing, happy sound, full of bubbles and life, like rain rushing across the valley. "Is that the river?" he blurted. "Are we nearly there?" "Are we nearly there? Are we going to catch salmon now? I can't wait. I'm going to catch so many salmon, Mother. Watch and see." They had left the snow behind them and were coming down through thick pine trees and clearings dotted with wildflowers. In front of them he could see the river glittering in the pale sunlight, a wide, shallow rush of water with pebbly shores on either side. He galloped ahead, nearly losing his balance on the expanse of pine needles that covered the steep hill. And suddenly Toklo saw bears. Bears were wading in the river, staring into the water. Bears were rolling on their backs in the water, splashing with their paws. Bears were pacing along the banks and running through the shallows, their fur sodden and spiky. Toklo had never seen so many bears in one place. They all looked so big. Most of them were larger than Oka, and they were all much, much larger than him. He slowed down at the edge of the trees and waited for his mother to catch up. Together they stepped into the sunshine, moving out of the cool shadows under the pines onto the long, pebbly riverbank. Toklo didn't like the way the other bears looked at him. They looked hungry. One bear, an enormous adult male, stood up on his hind legs in the water to stare at Oka and Toklo as they approached the riverbank. His claws were long and sharp, and he had the largest hump on his shoulders that Toklo had ever seen. His fur was dark from the water, and his muzzle was wet, as if he'd been diving for fish. He stared at Toklo with small, brown, unfriendly eyes. As they got closer, the bear dropped to its paws and loped over, standing between them and the river, blocking their path. Oka stopped, and Toklo ducked behind her front leg, trying not to make eye contact with the large grizzly. "Step aside," Oka said firmly. "What's your name, pretty?" the bear growled. "None of your business," she snapped. "I'm Shoteka," he announced. "We don't care," Oka snarled. "Now get out of our way. This isn't your territory. It's fair game for every bear. There's enough fish in the river for all of us." Shoteka's eyes shifted to Toklo. "It's not the fish I'm interested in," he said. "Your cub is too old to be still traveling with you." "No, I'm not," Toklo squeaked indignantly. He knew most cubs stayed with their mothers for at least 2 fish leaps. However much he wanted to be on his own and make his own decisions, he knew he wouldn't be able to look after himself for a long time yet. The male grizzly lifted his chin and looked challengingly at Oka. "When is he going to find his own territory?" "We're just here for the fish," Oka said, "so step aside." "There are no fish in this river," Shoteka rumbled. Oka snorted. "There have always been fish in this river. You're not going to drive us off with lies like that." She strode forward boldly, and the other bear fell back, scraping his paws on the pebbles with a show of reluctance. Toklo trotted after her, staying close to her hind paws. Just as they passed him, Shoteka lunged towards Toklo. His teeth were bared, and Toklo felt a blast of hot, rotten breath over his fur. Toklo froze. Suddenly, Oka was there, rearing up on her hind legs and roaring. She slashed at the male grizzly with her claws as Toklo ducked behind her. Shoteka stumbled back, then turned tail and ran, splashing away into the river. A few of the other bears snorted at one another. Toklo heard one of them say something about getting between a mother and her cubs, and he felt a warm swell of pride and relief. His mother was so strong, no one would mess with them now. It comforted him to know she would stick up for him, even though he wasn't Toby. Oka led the way upriver, moving as far away from Shoteka as possible. Toklo followed her into the shallows and gasped as the icy water tugged at his fur. It was much stronger than the streams in the valley. This water had power. He could almost believe that ancient bear spirits raced along in it. Smooth, round stones shifted under his paws, and he felt the silt of the river mud drifting up like mist as he waded through it. Toklo spun in a circle and splashed over to his mother, eager to start fishing. He could see a bear farther downriver, with a large fish in its jaws, flapping and shining in the light. Other bears were closing in on it, as if wondering whether the catch was worth fighting for. But Oka was not fishing. He could see from the looseness of her shoulders and the stillness in her paws that she was not waiting for something to swim by. Instead, she was staring into the water, talking in a soft voice. Toklo stopped splashing and listened. "Be careful, little cub," Oka whispered. "You have a long journey ahead of you." Her head dropped lower until her nose almost touched the water. "Look after him, water spirits, I beg you. He is so little and tired, and he's not used to being on his own." She was talking about Toby. Of course. Toklo sighed impatiently. He was sure the water spirits knew perfectly well that Toby was small and weak. Why else would he have died? If he'd been bigger and stronger, he'd still be alive like Toklo was. Shadows danced below the ripples as Toklo gazed into the water. He searched for any sign of the bear spirits in the river, but all he could see was the vague outline of his reflection and the shapes of pebbles in the riverbed. He'd expected to see the faces of bears, or a flash of fur, or a hint of claws racing along the muddy bottom. But there was nothing here but water. "I can't see Toby, Mother," Toklo said. He wondered if his little brother had figured out how to follow him down the mountain. It would be awful if Toby were stuck up in the barren rocks all alone. "Do you think he's here yet? Maybe he's still finding his way." Oka rounded on him with a snarl. "What do you know about death?" she growled. "You don't know anything." Toklo backed away. How was he supposed to know anything if she didn't teach him? Of course he didn't know much about death. Toby was the only bear he knew who'd ever died. And Oka had spent so much of their lives fussing over Toby that she'd hardly told Toklo anything. Toklo stomped over to a spot between two large rocks where the water flowed into a pool a little deeper than the rest of the river, reaching halfway up his legs. If his mother wanted to stand around talking to the river, that was fine. He'd learned to fish on his own. He looked around until he spotted a golden-furred female bear who was properly fishing. She crouched in the water, keeping still and watching. Suddenly, she leaped forward and dove into the water with her front paws. She must have missed what she was jumping for, because she pounced a few more times, chasing the fish around in a circle and sending up a spray of sparkling water drops. Finally, she emerged, dripping wet, with a small salmon in her jaws. She looked nervously at the other bears and then sat down with her back to them, the water foaming around her fur, eating quickly as if she wanted to finish before they noticed her catch. Toklo's mouth watered. Surely he could do that too. He could be patient and fast and determined, couldn't he? He turned around in the water a few times, looking for a good place to stand. He set his back to the current and left his legs planted wide apart so the river could flow between them. He waited for what felt like a very long time. His vision started to get blurry from staring at the water for too long. He kept expecting to see the dark shape of a fish swim between his paws, but there was nothing but the shimmer of sunlight on the ripples. Something dark moved just out of his reach. Toklo pounced, landing on his belly with a big splash as his paws closed around a mossy stick. He had barely a moment to feel disappointed. As soon as he lifted his paws off the stones, the current seized him and began dragging him downriver. He let out a startled yelp as the river swept him past his mother and a few other bears, but Oka didn't look up from her conversation with the river, and the other bears just seemed curious or amused. Flailing his paws, Toklo saw the huge grizzly who had attacked him earlier, waiting on a rock downstream. Shoteka had planted himself right in the path of the current and was watching as Toklo was swept closer and closer. "Mother!" Toklo yelped. "Help me!" He tried to stretch down and dig his claws into the pebbles, but the water swamped over his muzzle. He scrambled up to the surface, choking for breath, just as he crashed into the tree trunk legs of the male grizzly. Immediately, two massive paws seized his shoulders and shoved his head below the water. Toklo held his breath and lashed out with his paws, trying to claw at Shoteka's legs or kick his way free. His hind legs hit the bottom of the river, and he shoved himself to the surface again, sucking in a quick breath before the grizzly forced him under once more. Water flooded up Toklo's nose and surged into his mouth and ears. He tried biting and scratching the paws that held him down, but he could feel his strength starting to fade and his movements getting weaker. The murmurs of the river seemed louder underwater, crashing in his ears like the spirits shouting at him. All at once, the weight disappeared from his back. Toklo bobbed up to the surface, gasping for air. His paws scraped the stones on the bottom of the river, and he was able to pull himself into the shallows, where he collapsed onto his belly. He looked up and saw his mother driving Shoteka out of the water. She growled and charged at the male bear, her claws reaching for him and her mouth wide open. Shoteka roared angrily and scampered up the bank, disappearing into the trees. Toklo dragged himself to his paws, panting and shivering. Oka slowly came back, her sodden fur clinging to her thin frame. She stopped on the edge of the river bank and stared at him. "I'm sorry, Mother," Toklo whimpered. "I'm so sorry I tried to fish on my own. I won't do it again. I promise." Oka didn't move any closer. She seemed to be looking right through him. Toklo felt rooted to the spot, as if his legs were growing out of the riverbed. Why didn't his mother come to comfort him? When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse. "I can't do this," she said. "I can't watch my cubs die. I won't let it happen again." "Mother?" Toklo began. He'd heard about her first litter of cubs, who had all died in their first few moons. "Leave me," Oka growled. "Leave this territory. We're all going to starve here. If you must die, do it somewhere else, far away from me. Go away and don't come back." Hunching her shoulders, she turned and walked away, leaving Toklo standing alone in the river. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 9. I will see you soon.